Hello everybody, once again, another week gone, another plethora of developments. So we're back again. I'm Jared Freeland, this is John Alcock, and we're going to discuss a few things that have occurred for your absolute amusement, and hopefully you might get a bit more of a grasp of what's been happening. So, the Dunedin City Council has no balls. I couldn't think of any better way to put it. Basically, what's happened is 3 walking tracks down at one of their regional parks had names that came to be deemed offensive. Now, these names were Ginger Cougar, the Missus, and the Mistress. They were approved by the Dunedin City Council 11 years ago. And let me just look back through this article. Today, the DCC made a statement and said that they've released new names for the parks, which are, well, they're unoffensive, but are also very boring. +1, double glazed, and orange rough. Don't know what that's meant to be referring to. But they've replaced these supposedly offensive names at the Signal Hill track because they deemed them inappropriate. And in their statement, spokeswoman said that what's allowed and what's not allowed is different now to what it was 11 years ago. So the world has moved on, and somehow things are more offensive now than they weren't before. What do we have to say about that?
I think the first question immediately needs to be asked is, what did those names originally represent about those tracks? Were the people that named them considering something a bit more sentimental about those tracks? Was the Mistress, in fact, the track that some guy went and walked repeatedly over and over again to the detriment of his marriage, and that's why it became called the Mistress? I honestly don't know, but this is a complete waste of time and a complete waste of money. What are we paying these people for?
And that's the thing, but this is what we have to remember when it comes to this cancel culture. It doesn't matter the context. These are people who will see things devoid of context. They'll see them at face value. They seem completely incapable of understanding satire, and they will find anything to get offended by. It doesn't matter. There's no point in trying to work your way and work your moral sensibilities around people like that, because they will seek out things that make them offended in anything. They'll see inappropriate language, they'll see racism, they'll see sexism, they'll see things not only everywhere they even vaguely exist, but even where they don't exist.
It reminds me immediately of that Anita Sarkeesian meme, which is everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is misogynistic, and you've got to point it all out. We have so many people now employed in the public sector in this country that they have literally nothing to do. And all this is a mere justification of their existence, when what we should really be saying is, well, time to make you redundant then, isn't it? Goodbye.
I don't necessarily think it's the council who are the ones coming to these conclusions. What they're doing is they're bowing to pressure that's put on them basically by the media. These people who get perpetually offended didn't used to get so much attention, and for very good reason. And I think it shows, we look through, and it's very easy to see when the politically correct crowd have stepped over the line and when things have gone too far, because you just have to look at the comments on the pages on the news media when they put out stories like this. the Otago Daily Times, stuff.co.nz, the Herald and everything, and we know the audiences of Stuff and the Herald in particular are very left-leaning and are far more likely to approve of these decisions, and yet the comments are full of people saying the same thing. It's gone too far. It's absolutely
I would say
ridiculous.
the same thing about all the left-wing viewers and readers of and consumers of those materials, is that they also have nothing important to do with their time. And that is why they are sitting around making these comments and going, oh yeah, that's a great thing. We need to do this. Why? Why do we need to do this? Justify this to me economically in some sense. Where is the value in this? When it's obviously negative value in having the signs reprinted because it's costing the taxpayers money. And what it actually boils down to is the problem on economics of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. It makes a couple of people really happy who get really involved in this thing and they feel like they have won and it's really important to them. But the cost is dispersed over all the ratepayers. So everybody else can't really get upset about it because it only costs them a fraction of a cent to actually follow through with this. And therein lies the problem. Because it's such a small amount on such a regular basis for so many things, it actually adds up to being a huge amount overall. And I'm sure that everyone can think of immediately a couple of things where, I don't know, what's the signs going to cost? Let's say a couple of grand. That couple of grand could be better spent somewhere else. Maybe you'd be better off spending a few $1,000s at the low end, providing more medical care for people in your community, providing more aged care or disabilities care, or I don't know, any one of a billion other things that's higher up the priorities list than this waste of time. And on the plus side, you can probably get back their entire salaries from the public department as well, because obviously those people have nothing to do. It's absolutely insane.
Absolutely. But going on by, I don't believe the council, I mean, yes, they're the ones that came to this decision, but really, I think the problem is the fact that the media celebrates the loony fringe getting out of hand and complaining so much. And I think because it gets clicks, because it gets attention. And the vast majority of people who are employed in the media companies, and yes, I did study with them, I did study journalism and communications, so I do know a little bit about the kind of people who get those jobs. They tend to side, and in a lot of cases, they tend to be people who get perpetually offended by everything. And it's events like this, when you see what people are commenting and how much resistance we have to decisions like this, whether it's changing the branding of the Crusaders rugby team because, you know, apparently it was unacceptable and offensive in the wake of the Christchurch mosque attacks. You know, God forbid if a hurricane ever hit New Zealand and killed a whole bunch of people, because that rugby team will be next. But I think it's events like these which show how completely out of touch the media is with the general public. Nothing in, and I don't care that spokeswoman from the Dunedin City Council was saying that, you know, it's different now. What was acceptable 11 years ago is not acceptable now. I don't think anything has become less acceptable. The vocal minority of these hyperactive do-gooders and toxic PC types are getting far too much attention.
I'm actually going to disagree with you there.
Go ahead.
On the following grounds, I think it is actually, in a weird way, it is our fault. We have become so used to consuming media via clicks and paid for by advertising all the time that it's free to us as consumers when we're really the product. And what we actually do need to do, and I'll give a shout out to Stuff here, credit where credit's due, they have started putting up notifications on the bottom of their articles to say, would you like to become a Stuff supporter? Would you like to donate and help supporting our Stuff to do real journalism? And I think that is really the indication of the sea change in general, that we as consumers need to move away from this clickbait advertising rubbish that results in exactly this kind of stuff that you're talking about, and more towards actually paying for the things that we consume in a reasonable sort of way. And I'm not saying they should only be paid subscriptions. If you can't afford it, then watch some ads. Get some subscriptions that way. Make your advertising dollars that way. But for people who do have the means and the ability to pay for it, you should support good journalism. And it is really our lack of support for good journalism that has landed us in exactly this situation.
No, absolutely. No, I can't disagree with that in terms of, and you see the lack of quality in a lot of news media. It was directly born out of failure to make money. Of course, they're putting those citizen journalism ads up because they want the citizens to do the work for them. And it would be fantastic if they could get more balanced, and rather than just dogpiling on and taking a few complaints and writing articles saying that there's been a massive outrage against a few names of some walking tracks, which, by the way, does not represent what the general public in New Zealand think, certainly that would be welcome, but they would be doing it not to be better journalists. They'd be doing it to save money. And hey, if the effect is the same, I don't mind, but I really don't think that it would necessarily lead to more balance, because no doubt they would be very selective as to whose opinions that they actually publish.
Well, if you ended up going for a subscription model, you would inevitably end up forming bubbles. And I think that is particularly dangerous. Conservative people might always subscribe to the Herald, and left-leaning people might always subscribe to Stuff, or whatever it ends up being. And then the downside of that, of course, is you will create bubbles, because if you start to post conservative stuff as Stuff, you might find that some of your subscribers drop off. And that has its implicit dangers and biases too. I think you come back to, gotta have some kind of mixed model where I might be a Herald subscriber, but if I want to go and look at an article on Stuff, I can watch a 30-second advert and still access that content. And I think that gives you the best of both worlds and creates the least amount of ideological bubbles in the long run. It shouldn't go one way or the other. Have a mixed model.
And of course, you look around, anything has got to be better than the ridiculous situation we have now, especially in America, whereby you've got Fox News if you're a conservative, you've got everyone else if you're not, and nobody even attempts to to meet in the middle. I may have, yeah, exactly. I may have
in the middle, but he's subscriber based.
Yeah, exactly. And I may have mentioned it before, but basically, say you have this altercation between President Trump, at a press briefing, and he argues with a CNN journalist and calls him fake news. CNN would put MSNBC would put the video up and say, and it would have the caption or the synopsis, and it would say something along the lines of, Trump's merciless attacks on our reporters is a complete affront to democracy and the right of the fourth estate to be a watchdog of government. So you think, oh, well, that sounds a little biased. I'm going to look at Fox News. Fox News will put up the exact same video and they'll have the title, Trump schools biased CNN so-called journalist. Absolutely.
I made the mistake of subscribing to Fox News on YouTube, and I'm actually going to have to undo that subscription. And not because I disagree, but because I really only wanted to see a couple of Tucker Carlson's things every now and again. And now my whole subscription feed is inundated with nothing but Fox News propaganda. That also really pisses me off.
And look, that's the thing. They're all as bad as each other at the end of the day, whether I happen to agree with them or I don't. It's this yellow journalism, this ridiculous partisan nonsense, whereby they're not even attempting to get the other side of the story or fairly portray the other side of the story, and instead just chasing the masses. And look, the mainstream media have gone hard left. It's nothing new. They've been doing that for quite some time. And at the direct orders of Rupert Murdoch himself. And this isn't to denigrate some of the anchors on there. Tucker Carlson in particular, I believe, is a very genuine kind of guy. And he's honest in his reporting. However,
as far as we're aware.
As far as we're aware. Well, you look at it, if he really isn't a populist and he's just putting it on and he doesn't support Trump mostly and the Republicans mostly, then he's done so many interviews and had so many op-eds, and he's always saying the same thing generally. So, hey, it may be a facade, but the main point I'm making is he is in that evening primetime slot because Rupert Murdoch knows that he can make a hell of a lot of money chasing the Trump supporters because they've been completely abandoned by the rest of the media. And by the way, he owns a few more that can cater for the Trump haters too.
Carlson 2024?
I thought Shapiro was running in 2024.
Oh, I've heard both bandied around. So what was the next thing on the list?
The next thing was the government belatedly, I believe, getting Defence Force personnel to bolster the ranks of the private security people in making sure people in managed isolation are forced to stay in managed isolation, and that's a slippery slope, isn't it?
In a way. So when we first talked about that, yes, I initially thought on what I saw on the reporting that the military was being used for general policing purposes and to enforce quarantines of people hosed and those kind of things. And I actually believe that was a misreporting, or at least a misunderstanding on my part of what was happening. Given that we're already paying the military to provide security services anyway, and they're only being used at managed isolation facilities, I think I actually kind of have come around to your point a little bit, which, like, it's already a service that we're paying for. Why not use them for that? I just don't want them to become a slippery slope where we actually do fall into a police state, which is honestly how I thought Mike Hosking was reporting it. And that's not actually the case. And that's only because it was Mike's minute. So there just wasn't that information there. So I needed to do a bit more research.
Well, it's always going to be a scary proposition when we have the Defence Force acting against the civilians in that way. But at the same time, I think, and this will go on to the third topic of the night soon, but I think in these very critical times, the government is justified in putting hard measures out there. Judith Collins released National's plan, which was quite a lot harsher, and I certainly approve of it, testing people before they even get on the plane and making sure they're testing negative to COVID, and David Seymour as well. Basically,
define justified for me though in this circumstance.
To prevent the extreme level of harm that will come from allowing the coronavirus to spread freely throughout New Zealand.
The 0.28 maximum death potential that COVID has, as in way, way less than even the flu causes an average year?
Yes.
So how is that extreme? I mean, we don't wear face masks or lockdown for the flu, and that killed 500 people last year, as I posted on my Facebook page. COVID's killed 22. Not really very extreme.
COVID's killed 22 because it wasn't spreading here like it has in many other countries. You would recall the horrific scenes of army trucks carting corpses of coronavirus victims through Italy, and
misrepresented victims of COVID, because they were literally writing down every single death that ever happened at that time as COVID, and that is inaccurate reporting.
And look, I'll give you a free kick on this. Quite a lot of people who have died from COVID-19, they had many underlying health issues anyway. They were compromised already. I'm not talking down the seriousness of it at all, but COVID finished quite a lot of people off rather than being a direct cause of their of their demise.
That may be the case, but if they'd caught the common cold, that would have finished them off, but we wouldn't have locked down because it's common. And
COVID-19 is far more, it spreads far easier than the common cold.
so does HIV.
And
We don't lock down for that.
HIV requires far more physical contact to spread than COVID-19.
It is transferred in blood and serum and spittle, and so you can get it from all of those things as well. It's just less infectious than COVID. But the common cold is just as infectious. The flu is just as infectious. There are plenty of other diseases out there that are just as infectious. So I just don't see the justification for this extreme measure of putting literally everyone in New Zealand out of work, preventing them from able to do anything, preventing them from able to go anywhere or have interactions with any other people. In social animals like people, that is so destructive. I have people messaging me all the time who are isolated by themselves and they can't do anything about it. The rate of suicide is going up. And if you look at the total death rates for COVID, it's 0.28%. It's 0.28%. That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. I think less than 1% of the world's population has been infected and died from it. And most of those in countries that were ill prepared for this in the first place. As I've also posted on Facebook recently, the opportunity cost of this, $140 billion at least at the moment, and $440 million a week costing us for this COVID. I would much rather, well, the first opportunity that I can think of that's better spent on their money would be to spend that money, $140 billion, on the public health system and not lock down at all. If you chose that route, which is the option B in this opportunity cost scenario, we would be better off and we would have a much better public health system at the end of it and something to show for it. What we are currently doing is pissing money down the drain to pay people to do nothing. And that is patently absurd.
And certainly there will be a reckoning when it comes to that massive debt that the government has accrued in the wage subsidy schemes and trying to...
Not just ours.
Absolutely. In America too, the national debt is, I can't remember the exact number of trillions that they added to it this time, but it was quite substantial.
A lot. And I think you really have to justify the amount of suffering that that is going to cause in real dollar value terms when you're considering the opportunity cost of the decisions that you're making when you're in charge of a country. And I'm sorry, but I just do not see, even if you let COVID infect every person in this country, your cost is not even going to be close to 140 billion. It just won't be, because the death rate is 0.28%. So like, at absolute maximum, if every single person that got COVID died of it at that rate, that's 140,000 people at the absolute most. But putting 1.6 to 2 million people out of work, 50% of whom are technically redundant now, even though they don't realize it yet, and then selling us and all our future generations down the river to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, which we're never going to be able to pay back. And the interest cost is going to accrue at such a rate that it will never, ever be paid off, is completely insane. It does not, if it had a 50% death rate, you might have an argument, but it doesn't. 0.28%. The worst possible figures collected by the global research organizations is 0.28%. If you want the data for that, you can go and look at my Facebook page. I posted it there.
No, you're absolutely right. I don't doubt that. Remember,
that's my question. What's your definition of extreme?
At the time we locked down, we didn't have that data yet. They were, and look, I agree they went far too far in the other direction. They assumed it was going to be a lot worse than it was. But even at the time, they had revised it down when we first went into lockdown back in late March. And I believe that the estimated death toll wasn't 0.28%. 2%. No, it was higher. It was something like 6 or 7. This was based on, remember we had the stats from Iran then, and it was particularly bad there. But what I believe the aim was, and it progressed to elimination, which, yes, I'm with you, that is next to impossible. Hey, it'd be great if we did pull it off, but we haven't so
But you have
far.
to do it globally. And since that's not possible, stop making goals that are impossible.
All right. But the whole point, and this is part of the reason why it didn't kill too many people in New Zealand, was because it didn't overwhelm our medical system. And the main point of locking down was to stop the hospitals getting absolutely chock full and then not being able to administer aid to people who did get it.
And I won't relitigate with hindsight. I have no real problems with what Jacinda did at the beginning of the lockdown, except she was 2 weeks late. I mean, seriously, like people were telling her to do it first, and all she had to do was close the borders for a couple of weeks, and we would have found this information out. So while I don't really want to relitigate the beginning of that, because that's happened in the past, and hindsight is 2020, and that would be completely unfair of me to do that in this case, she is absolutely responsible for the current level 2 and level 3 lockdown in New Zealand at the moment. That's costing $440 million a week just in wage subsidy payments, not to account for all the business and productivity that's lost and the fact that our supply chains are getting screwed up as a result of this. It's just nuts.
Well, even without lockdowns, I think there was always going to be a massive economic price to pay simply because of the slowdown in global trade and the collapse of the supply chains. Really, at the end of the day, and as David Seymour has pointed out, 70% of the infrastructure work in New Zealand depends on foreign labour, whether that's guys on the ground or engineers, infrastructure, anything like that. It's 70% foreign labour. And when we can't bring people in, that is going to have a massive toll on New Zealand's economy.
Which is why I would have argued for spending $140 billion on improving our public health system and not locking down at all.
Certainly. And I think there'll be a lot of people with you on whether
Fewer than you'd think.
On whether the latest lockdown was justified or not. Regardless if we think about level 4, which I'm of the opinion that, yes, we got desperate, but hey, we weren't closing the border effectively. There were videos coming out where people were coming into the country, they could have coronavirus, indeed quite a lot of them did, and all we were doing was bringing them through customs and handing them a brochure that said, like, here is a few tips on how to isolate yourself for 14 days. Why on earth they thought they could trust people to do that, I've absolutely no idea. Why on earth they thought they could just tell people to isolate themselves and hope that they stay there without putting members of the Defence Force and private security firms outside of the hotel, I have no idea. And look,
I think this comes down to the point that we were discussing a little bit before, which is you could take that approach. You could take that approach and assume as a base level that everyone is untrustworthy. But I think you very, very quickly run into problems there if you make that assumption. And to prevent yourself becoming an absolute police state by assuming that at a very base level, you can't trust anyone. And now you're living in a very low trust society, that's just not the way Western societies are. If you live in a low trust society, then nobody goes to work, nobody leaves the house, nobody trusts their stuff to be taken care of by anyone, there are no property rights. You end up going down that path very quickly and you end up in one of two places, always. Communism or fascism. And that's just the way it is. So at a very basic level, you have to have an implicit level of trust in people of society that they're going to at least try and do the right thing most of the time. And that's generally true of most people. So were I to modify the current government's plans, and not to relitigate a bag on them from before either, under the current situation, I would say, right, you're in managed quarantine. We implicitly trust you to stay in managed quarantine. We will come and check that you are here, that you're staying in the quarantine, that you're doing what we've instructed you to do for public health reasons, whether you think they're justified or not. And if for any reason you are not there, you will immediately be given a home detention bracelet, which you will be now confined to your room and not allowed to leave. If you try to escape or try to defuse the device after that, you will immediately be put in prison. And I think that is the logical progression that you have to start from in a Western liberal democracy, where you have implicit trust, somebody breached their trust, you take step one, somebody breached their trust, now you lock them away. And only by following that kind of procedure can you come to moral, ethical, and reasonable outcomes in pretty much every circumstance. Are you going to get burned? Yep, that's the price you pay for trust.
Do you believe that in some circumstances, of course I'm talking about COVID-19 at present, but there could be other circumstances. Another one that comes to mind is the Patriot Act over in America in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, trying to trace down the suspected sleeper cells and terrorists involved curtailing the freedom of ordinary Americans. Also, Guantanamo Bay, enhanced interrogation techniques, which the UN defined as torture. The American government of the time argued that it was justified in getting more information and preventing another terrorist attack. Do you think that despite, I understand in a liberal democracy, these are extreme measures, but do you think that there are times where it is appropriate for the government to enact certain measures and curtail certain rights if it's for a good cause? And I know that's a really grey area, but
Define good cause.
I think a lot of people...
Good cause or my good cause? Or a good cause?
I think a lot of people would agree that reducing the harm that arises from COVID-19 that we've seen all around the world.
58 million Americans thought that Hillary Clinton was a good cause. Really? Really? Was it? That's not how democracy works. You cannot... Authoritarianism
there's no argument to this, John.
Authoritarian lives at the end of it.
That I can make,
Authoritarianism lives at the end of this path, and that is the actual war between libertarianism and authoritarianism. Do you want a high trust society where you trust most people to make decisions that don't damage other people? I think is really what you're looking for. Not good and bad. Those terms are nebulous and meaningless. What you're really concerned about is, can people get on with their own lives, and whether or not doing that damages other people, and then how do you internalize the negative externalities of those actions? So you should be able to do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. And everyone else should be able to do whatever they want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. That's the point. But if you start saying, my cause is good, well, then anyone can say my cause is good. And communists might say, well, communism is good. It's obviously good. Therefore, we enforce communism. And the fascists will say exactly the same thing on the other side. And what you'll end up with is World War II Germany, because that's what happens. And war's not good for anyone. War only destroys wealth. It never creates it.
So going from this week's events, getting the military in to help people with their managed isolation, my goodness, flashbacks to George Orwell's Animal Farm. And Squealer the propaganda pig spoke so convincingly, and the evil guard dogs flanking either side of him growled so menacingly, the animals had no choice but to agree. Does John Alcock think that there's any risk of New Zealand descending down that horrible path and becoming a communist state based on the current developments and the measures that our government have been putting in place?
As of today, no, I don't think so. And I think that really touches on our third topic, actually. That's exactly what we're talking about there. So no, I don't think that is the case. I don't think we're in danger of becoming a communist utopia or a fascist utopia. I think liberalism is too strong in New Zealand, and I really hope that people vote that way in the elections. This is what MMP is for, people. Vote for the party that represents you the best. Don't vote for my party. Don't vote for anyone else's party. Go and have a look at what the policy says and vote for the party that represents you best. That's the point.
I think you mispronounced the word dystopia.
No, I definitely mean utopia. Utopia is how the communists would describe it.
Okay, so the third topic of the night is the
unlawful but justified. The decision that's just come down from the High Court, where a lawyer in Wellington took the government to task for implementing level 4 in an inappropriate manner that was not consistent with the rule of law. and won. The High Court agreed with him that it was a breach of Section 5 of the Bill of Rights Act, just off the top of my head. And even though it was a breach of the Bill of Rights Act under our legislation, it was justified in the circumstances.
And I think that's very interesting because really that goes with the whole power to the people at the end of the day. The citizens fighting back, and I'm very glad that a member of the public did this because really, at the end of the day, even if for a cause that will almost universally be considered by the public of New Zealand as being for the greater good, I'll choose my words a bit more carefully than before,
lest I be nitpicky about some arbitrary stuff again.
That's the thing, I keep looking back into it because, of course, George Orwell would have warned us about people who claim to choose their words carefully when they're trying to say exactly the same thing.
Yep.
But really, at the end of the day, regardless of what the government believes is a good cause, they still need to act in a lawful manner. And for the
Correct.
first 9 days of the level 4 lockdown, the government did not act in a lawful manner.
I mean, I posted that article up to my Facebook page again and got a bunch of people saying pretty much the same thing. So, oh, it doesn't matter. It was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. I just don't care. I don't care. We have the rule of law in this country, and that is paramount to pretty much everything. Because if you don't have the rule of law, then anyone can claim anything. And eventually, somebody will come and claim the thing that you're doing is not for the greater good, and they will come and get you. It is, oh, I don't want to quote that. What is that Nazi quote? First they came for this group of people. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. If you have a situation which the rule of law no longer applies, and you don't get to vote on the parties that are putting policies and procedures and actual legislation into practice in New Zealand, or any country, eventually somebody will make a law and they will come and get you. Because there is only one actual law, and that is might makes right. At the end of the day, without the rule of law, he who has the most guns will kill everybody else, and that will be right. And you will have no damn say in it. And we must avoid that outcome at all costs, because we have seen now twice on a global scale how that happens. And we've agreed not to do that anymore.
Could you elaborate on said 2 examples?
World War I and World War II. So he who has the most guns, has the biggest army, controls the world. And the Germans had to be put down twice for doing that. They thought they were right.
Well, it's a very slippery slope. I mean, America was engaged in the fight against communism and in containing the horrible influence of communist dictatorships. And ever since, they've been absolutely lambasted for their interventions in Korea and Vietnam and in many other countries. They believed they were doing the right thing. I know the residents of South Korea believed, and indeed still believe, they absolutely did the right thing. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the slippery slope of, you know, who's to say...
It comes back to might is right. In all of those circumstances, I would say exactly the same thing. My position is consistent across the whole board. I don't care if you're fighting communism. I don't like communists. I don't like fascists either. But I don't care what you're doing. You must have a governmental circumstances in place where the rule of law is paramount about everything else, and that you have no laws in place that prevent anyone from living in the way that they want to do, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. If you wanted to have the Koreas and the North wanted to be communist, hardcore dictatorship communist, okay, you elect some lady to be the leader of your commune and go and live over there. But they prevent people from leaving. So they prevent people from making a choice, and they prevent people from coming and joining them as well. So now you have a problem because you're actively damaging other people's ability to literally, from the Constitution, the life, pursuit of happiness.
Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Yes. You are literally actively preventing people from doing that now. But you can, in a completely liberal society, you can form your own commune, You can do that right now in New Zealand if you want. There are examples of communes that are out there in New Zealand actively working, where everybody agrees that they want to be part of the commune and they go and join it. Okay, do it then. You could have a shareholder-owned corporation or worker-owned corporation if you really wanted to. They don't tend to work very well, but you could. There's nothing preventing you from doing so. You could have an absolute fascist organization as well that had an extremely peaked hierarchy where all the decisions were made by somebody at the top. Okay, if you want to go and work there, that's on you. I'm not telling you you shouldn't. I just don't think either of those systems work particularly well. But they can both coexist under liberalism. But they can't. Liberalism and either one of the others cannot coexist under either communism or fascism, which is why you can't have those. You got to have the rule of law, and you've got to have basically the libertarian principles. Property rights. Property rights are the primary thing. You've got to have property rights. So I'm very glad that the court actually did this and that this lawyer was able to bring this case against the government. Not because it achieves anything, but because it does prove that the rule of law still exists in this country.
And it will achieve something. It's still early days, but from the discussions that I've heard about it, I believe that because it was unlawful, nobody is actually going to be charged for breaches in those first 9 days. And there were quite a lot of them.
I called it at the time. Said none of those people are going to get fined. Oh,
and certainly I have been advocating of harsher penalties, and I thought that in the circumstances, yes, the fines and the punishments should have been a lot more severe. So I don't get my wish after all, for the first 9 days at least, and that is bound to make you happy, I'm sure.
Thank God for that. He said being incredibly sacrilegious.
And hey, I think that's it. That is another Wednesday night discussion. You know, some people go out clubbing on Wednesday nights, but we're not allowed to do that because we're at level 3 lockdown. So
honestly, I'd rather do this.
So would I. I was never into clubbing. That's the funny thing.
Been there, done that. It just costs a shitload of money and has negative results.
And look, if I wanted to sit there with a bunch of strangers and listen to that awful pop music for hours on end, I'd go and work in a shoe store.
Oh, I definitely like the doof doof, but yeah, this is us becoming old men, really, isn't it? And going to bars and things. I wish they'd turn the music down so we could hear each other think.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. It caught up to me. It was always going to happen.
I'm pretty sure.
I'm not gonna yell at anyone to get off my lawn yet.
I started old. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good time to call it there. Otherwise, we'll end up blabbing on for 10 million hours and everyone will get incredibly bored. So, thanks all for watching. If you've got any comments, leave them below. If you'd like to come and join us, send us a message. Otherwise, see you next week.
Cheers. Thank you very much.